Good day, good people. I'm reading on my Facebook Live and my Instagram Live. Storytime with more of my. This is your girl, Morgan Renee Myers, tuning in with another read. So, today is February 14th in the year of our Lord 2024, aka Valentine's Day. We're also in the midst of Black History Month. And I woke up wanting to shower myself with love today and do things that I love to do, as I'm going to have the day to myself. And I love reading books about Black people's lives. So I said, let me wake up and read. So I've read this book before in years past, but didn't finish it. And so I just found a bunch of those videos. I read like 5 chapters on live. I downloaded them, uploaded them all on my YouTube. I've also created a story time with more in my Facebook group. And I have a picture of this book cover with all the links to those links I just uploaded. But I'm going to pick back up where I stopped off in that summer a few years ago, which was chapter 5, and finish that up, and then I'll resume reading live. But yeah, I want to talk about Fannie Lou Hamer's life. I love learning about Black people's lives, and I love her life and the things she represented and stood up for the lives of other Black folks. So let's get into it. Where I stopped on the last live, it started getting a little choppy. I was outside recording, and so I'm just going to back up a few pages and start there. So we're in chapter 5, and the name of this book is called For Freedom's Sake, The Life of Fannie Lou Hamer by Chana Lee. So I'm on page 93, chapter 5, The National Stage. During this nearly 3-hour meeting, the Freedom Democrats made it clear that they would accept no less than the Green proposal, which was already somewhat of a treatment on the NFDP's part, since the Green offer was itself a compromise, one that was far less radical than the NFDP's original demand to be ceded unconditionally. During the meeting, Moses reminded others that only Negroes could speak for Negroes in Mississippi, to which Humphrey responded that meant only Russians could speak for Russians, Frenchmen for Frenchmen. He turned to King and added, "Now you can throw your book away." After Ruoff got up to speak, Ella Baker responded by adding, according to Raoul's interview, "I don't care about people getting $20,000 a year judgeships," referring to Verna Canton. "And I don't care about some professor losing his job. I don't care about traitors like Humphrey deserting their liberal trend." As her colleagues, Baker and Moses castigated those in favor of additional compromise, charging them with indulging in political self-interest, Hamer again took the moral high road, this time by invoking religion and God. She singled out an equivocating Humphrey, whom she later described as sitting there with big crocodile tears in his eyes. "Senator Humphrey, I've been praying about you, and I've been thinking about you, and you're a good man, and you know what's right. The trouble is you're afraid to do what you know is right. You want this job, and I know a lot of people have lost their jobs, and God will take care of you even if you lose this job. But Humphrey, if you take this job, you won't be worth anything." Darn. "Mr. Humphrey, I'm going to pray for you again." Just as Humphrey had started crying, so did Hamer. Baker and Hamer were not the only ones moved to anger and disgust by Humphrey's condensation. Earlier, Green had stormed out of the meeting when Humphrey remarked, "Well, I don't see what all the people from the Credentials Committee are doing here anyway." Waskow described the meeting at the Pageant Motel as evidently a most upsetting occasion. Moses came down from it looking like death itself. The minority, the NFDP, and the supporters had proved far stronger, far more numerous, and far more tough-minded than the administration or the liberal establishment had expected. In other words, our strength had forced another delay. So, significantly, this meeting involved a major confrontation among white liberals, national civil rights leaders, and the Freedom Democrats. Okay, so this is where I ended in chapter 5. I'm picking back up. At 7 that Monday night, the Freedom Democrats held a spirited rally along the boardwalk to show the strength of its support from one state delegations and individual backers who showed up just for the historic occasion. Led by Hamer singing and spontaneous appeals for support, over 3,000 people participated. Waskow noted, "It was exciting, it was heart-lifting, and the general jubilation was reinforced. Up to this point, the MFDP delegation still had the full support of Martin Luther King Jr., who, nursing a sprained ankle, stood on the boardwalk encouraging delegates to seat the Freedom Democrats. When the convention session ended that night, the Freedom Party and its supporters had completed extensive lobbying, and the mood of optimism had returned. For the most part, everyone expected a floor fight on Tuesday, resulting in a roll call vote that the MFDP would win. Tuesday morning started with another MFDP caucus at its church headquarters. A hasty meeting was called for the Freedom Party delegation and staff. The discussion topic was the latest Johnson proposal: 2 seats for 2 designated people, Aaron Henry and Ed King, and the 2 at-large seats that would have no ties to the regular Mississippi delegation. Moses was present, and he was trying to get the MFDP delegation to decide on the least that could be agreed to. Hamer, Baker, and Raoul were also in attendance. Although most accounts of Hamer's participation in the convention depict her as resolute and confident about not compromising, this movement was actually not an easy one for her. She found herself indecisive. In fact, she even later described her mood as desperate. During the course of discussion, she went over to Bob Moses and asked, "What in the world should we do?" She added, "I believe it's wrong for us to accept the compromise. I really believe it's wrong. But do you think we ought to accept?" Moses pointed out that since this is going to affect the people in Mississippi directly, it would only be right that the MFDP delegates come to a decision on their own. Slowly reclaiming her assurance of the correctness of her original position, Hamer replied, "That I'm going to make it even if it is wrong. I know that 2-seat compromise don't mean nothing to me." She rejoined the rest of the delegation, and finally they all agreed that the Green proposal was acceptable, but not the Lyndon Johnson compromise. Then the MFDP and the SNCC staff found this back-of-the-bus offer to be too much of an insult. On this Tuesday, the Credentials Committee went into a closed executive meeting. Raoul attended the session alone. The committee continued forcing the 2-seat compromise. Raoul hesitated and fought for an adjournment so that he could result with the full delegation. He failed. After the meeting, according to Raoul, the head of the subcommittee rushed up to the first media person in sight and announced, "Here is the majority report. The MFDP accepts it." Raoul was then confronted by the reporter, to whom he responded, "I haven't consulted with the MFDP yet," and Raoul later charged that the subcommittee chair had lied. However, the damage had been done. As far as Hamer and the other delegates were concerned, news reports announced that a compromise had been reached. MFDP delegates suspected that Raoul had disobeyed party orders and entered into a deal with the committee that favored his close friend Hubert Humphrey and the rest of the Lyndon Johnson camp. This proved to be the incident that precipitated the eventual rupture between Raoul and a hardline Hamer-influenced Freedom Democrat faction, which held a majority in the MFDP. Another meeting took place at the Paget Motel as Raoul met the Credentials Committee. Present were Bob Moses, Aaron Henry, Ed King, Baynard Rustin, Martin Luther King Jr., Walter Reuther, and Hubert Humphrey. By most accounts, this closed executive meeting proved to be a no-holds-barred affair that resulted in white liberals and national civil rights leadership agreeing to push full speed ahead into getting the MFDP to accept the administration's compromise. This was the memorable meeting from which Fannie Lou Hamer was excluded, and for that reason it became well publicized and regarded as nefarious in MFDP circles, despite the presence of Bob Moses. According to Tillow, the day before, they had Mrs. Hamer in that meeting, and she must have given them hell, so they cut her out. Those present returned to consideration of the compromise. When Baynard Rustin asked whether the 2-vote compromise might include Hamer proceeding, Humphrey added, "The president will not allow that illiterate woman to speak from the floor of the convention." Wow. The entire meeting was devoid of any talk of abstract notions of wrong or right regarding the challenge. The tone and content of discussion grew decidedly political. Mincing few words, participants spoke of who was beholden to whom. This was especially true of conversations that the United Auto Workers president Walter Reuther had with Martin Luther King Jr. and Joseph Raoul. Reportedly, during the course of the meeting, Reuther reminded King that the labor movement gave King and SCLC $176,000, and they won't give them any more if they won't go along. Later, Bob Moses said that Reuther remarked, "Joe Raoul works for me, and he's not going to sign any minority report." Eventually, Moses left this meeting before it adjourned. The Freedom Democrats' suspicion regarding Raoul's role in creating the compromise continued to grow. Furthermore, MFDP leadership concluded that, based on what the party instructed Raoul to do before going into the closed meeting, he should have immediately rejected any and all other compromises presented to him up to that point. Many MFDP delegates concluded that Raoul had been presented this compromise by Humphrey, Reuther, the General Liberal Establishment, and the Lyndon Johnson administration in order to get the Freedom Party to accept it. Also enlisted in this compromise effort were Martin Luther King Jr., Farmer, Baynard Rustin, and the MFDP chairman, Aaron Henry. The feeling was that, without question, Raoul and Henry had betrayed the delegation. At around 6 that evening, the MFDP delegation caucused at the church and pressed its leadership for official rejection of this new compromise. Edith Green joined the MFDP representatives in being upset. She thought she had been lied to, partly by the MFDP because of Raoul's public blunder, and certainly by the Credentials Committee itself. Also attending this meeting were the Credentials Committee supporters and others, including Verna Canson, who were now saying that they could not sign a stronger minority report. Even Martin Luther King Jr. was now suggesting that the Johnson proposal was perhaps the best that the MFDP could get. By this point, the Freedom Party members felt angry and betrayed. Fannie Lou Hamer summed up the group's mood when she observed that the offer of 2 votes for 2 named people was exactly the kind of offer that might be expected from Southern whites, and was exactly the reason the Freedom Party was fighting for justice in Mississippi, and therefore it was totally unacceptable. Waskow described the mood as one of enormous bitterness, obviously resulting from deeply disappointed hopes that the Freedom Party had been about to win when the issue went to the floor. According to Waskow, this bitterness was directed at liberals, Democrats, and the regular political system. As an MFDP delegate, Annie Devine called for a vote, which was taken by a show of hands and resulted in an immediate rejection of the Johnson Compromise. The delegation reiterated that it would accept no less than the Green proposal. The MFDP had reason to believe that it would still win a floor fight if it could just get the opportunity. It continued getting tremendous support from the American public in the many telegrams it received. Also, at the beginning of that afternoon, at least 22 committee members were ready to vote in favor of the Green resolution, but this number was quickly reduced to half by the introduction of the 2-seat compromise. The meeting concluded, and the MFDP delegation left for the convention hall, where Moses reportedly suggested a sit-in on the convention floor by the Freedom Democrats and their supporters. A group of SNCC and court activists made a circle around 3 MFDP delegates and attempted to push their way into the hall, but with no success. Thanks in part to passes from the Oregon, Michigan, and Colorado delegations, other Freedom Democrats and their staff did succeed in getting on the floor. Instead of sitting with their host delegations, the Freedom Democrats took these invitations and sat at the Mississippi Standard. Once in, MFDP delegates then sent their passes back outside to other Freedom Democrats still waiting to enter. 5 or 6 managed to get to the Mississippi spot on the floor. A crowd started forming around the Mississippi Standard, and this kept more MFDP delegates and their supporters from being removed. Many Freedom Democrat sympathizers used their bodies as non-lethal obstacles to police action. Meanwhile, hundreds held a support rally outside of the convention hall. Later that evening, there was more talk of a larger civil disobedience protest, but MFDP and COFO leaders rejected this, fearing that such an operation would increase nationwide opposition to the MFDP and the movement. Some kept their attention on whether to reconsider the compromise for at-large seats. Elsewhere, another debate ensued between Freedom Party delegates and staff and the national leadership of the Civil Rights Movement. It took place in Kingsley. The debate was initiated by Aaron Henry, who was prodding from Johnson faithful, was determined to get the Freedom Party to reconsider its rejection of the 2-seat offer. He invited Ed King, Farmer, Rustin, and some National Council of Churches representatives to address the delegation. Rustin argued that the administration's compromise solution be turned into a public image victory and urged acceptance of the compromise. He insisted on a coalition among blacks, labor, and liberals. Martin Luther King Jr. did not urge reconsideration, but he did say, upon being questioned by Moses, that he would not have rejected the Johnson proposal in the first place. He stressed that there was a danger involved in labeling supporters of the compromise as sellouts. He called on Freedom Democrats and SNCC staff to be more respectful of strategic and tactical differences. However, King, unlike the National Council of Churches representatives, did express his support for a sit-in as a creative response to the tension and bitterness that had resulted. He vowed continued support of the MSDP no matter what it finally decided. Like the others, James Farmer also encouraged the Freedom Party to accept the compromise. Can I be real? This is my least favorite part of this book. All this politics talk is stressing me out. Alright, let me get through it. A number of Freedom Democrats and their supporters responded to the comments of the national civil rights leaders. One was Rita Schwerner, who condemned the entire proceeding as a sellout. She noted that she no longer had any interest in opening up the Democratic Party and thought that reconsideration of the rejection was unnecessary. She even challenged Baynard Rustin's right to speak in light of what little, if anything, he had contributed to the Freedom Summer Project. She also voiced her disagreement with a sit-in because it showed an interest in wanting to be part of the Democratic Party. Waskow stood up and denounced the national civil rights leadership for encouraging the separation of morality and politics. He said further that political success should be determined on moral grounds. Fannie Lou then rose and said in her inimitable style that she was not in the least bit interested in reconsidering any motion. When one of the pro-compromise participants urged her and the others to listen to their leaders, Hamer snapped back, "Who is the leader? I know you ain't been in Mississippi working with us. Who is he?" When asked later to elaborate on this point in her concept of leadership, Hamer said, "See, I can't see a leader leading me nowhere if he's in New York and I'm down here catching hell." Ella Baker then took up where Hamer left off, adding a few points of her own regarding loyalty and leadership. Baker responded to Raoul's somewhat patronizing appeal to forgive. The great heart of the Negro people had demonstrated its capacity for forgiveness and understanding, and I will hope that in this situation, blacks will still be able to demonstrate this capacity for understanding. At this point, Raoul asked that they acknowledge that Humphrey's vice presidency was at stake. Baker remarked that this was the kind of thing that we had to come to grips with, and those who claim to be with us will be with us when the going got rough, as well as when it was easy. To call upon us to be understanding of Mr. Humphrey's desire to win was saying, forget what you need, you're winning, and supporting his winning. Addressing the inherent tension between local need and grassroots leaders on one hand and abroad, unfocused national civil rights agendas on the other, Moses called on the people to remember that the primary allegiance of the Freedom Party belongs to Mississippi and its own hopes and desires. He added that the Freedom Democrats needed to be concerned about pleasing not the American liberal establishment, but instead their constituents. In doing so, he implied rejection. The 68 Freedom Democratic Party delegates again voted unanimously to reject the Johnson administration's compromise. A question was then raised about an alternative course of action for the evening. This time, a sit-in was proposed and finally agreed to. Following the vote, the mood, as described by Waskow, was still one of defeat, but not complete failure or loss of hope of working within the Democratic Party. Waskow said, "Well, we were beaten, but not by too much, and we showed enormous power against the overwhelming efforts of the administration. We can now see how to carry on within the Democratic Party." According to Waskow's account, in this regard, there was some split between Schwerner's complete abandonment and Moses' reserved hope that the civil rights movement demands to be pursued through traditional politics. But other participants were not so sure that there was a clear split. According to Baker, I would imagine that certainly settled any debate he might have had about the possibility of functioning through the mainstream of the Democratic Party, especially if we were having to have a coalition-type relationship. Now, I don't know that Bob really believes that they would be seated. Maybe he did. I haven't talked with Bob about this, but I should imagine it had great impact on him. I don't know. After the discussion, some doubt remained, so deliberations continued, leaving open the possibility of another vote on the matter. On August 26th, the MSDP delegates met and made a final decision not to accept this compromise. They were prepared to deliver the official notification to the Credentials Committee, so everyone thought. Aaron Henry, the delegate chairman, was not so sure, however. He insisted on accepting the compromise with a demand for 24 votes instead of just 2. Henry sought the approval of the most influential member of the delegation. "Mrs. Hamer," he remarked, I'm going out and we're going to compromise for 24 votes. Hamer, enraged by the mere thought of compromise, replied to Henry, "Why are you going to compromise for 24 votes, Dr. Henry? You know good and well that we won't have but 2. If you go out there and say that, you stay there. Don't you come home. You better stay in that convention hall, then the balance of your life. Because if you come out, I'm going to cut your throat. After entering the hall and taking a seat, the microphone was passed to Henry, and he quickly responded, "No compromise." Hamer then followed up with her now oft-repeated declaration, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats." There were many influential black leaders who disagreed with the MSDP's final decision. Among them was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who supported the compromise, arguing that out of thesis and antithesis should come synthesis. Out of thesis and antithesis should come synthesis. Although he had supported the MSDP's efforts since the beginning, King wanted the delegation to come away with something of political value. However, he also recognized a need for the delegation not to take part in tokenism. Fannie Lou Hamer came away especially disgusted with the NAACP, particularly Roy Wilkins, who during the convention had told Hamer, "You all are just ignorant. You have put your point across. You should just pack your bags up and go home." This infuriated Hamer so that upon returning home, she immediately stopped paying her $2 NAACP annual membership fee. In subsequent interviews, she minced no words when discussing her feelings for the NAACP, often noting, "There ain't nothing that I respect less than the NAACP." Although Hamer was far more reserved when reflecting on the role of the SCLC and Martin Luther King Jr., she made it clear that she was not at all happy with them either. Her criticisms of King often took the form of disagreement with his tactics or unhappiness about the attention and credit his 1965 Selma campaign received for passage of the Voting Rights Act. Keenly aware of King's popularity in life and in death, Hamer was always extremely cautious about publicly criticizing him, in part because he had died such a tragic death while serving the movement, and she did not want any strikes against him. Hamer's trouble with King seemed to have to do with his company rather than his abandonment of principles generally held among movement activists. In fact, Hamer refused to attend King's funeral because she couldn't remorse about the hypocrites who were there. The MSDP's failure to unseat the all-white delegation led to the disillusionment and radicalization of certain MSDP members, especially Hamer, who in subsequent lectures lashed out at Tom teachers and chicken-eating ministers in reference to those blacks at the convention who claimed to be leaders of the people but were so ready to accept compromise. She later referred to them as the black bourgeoisie and accused them of always thinking they're white. About them, she often remarked, "Give them $2 in a car and they think they're free." After the convention, Hamer not only became disenchanted with traditional black leadership, but she also became even more disillusioned with the white power structure. In her autobiography, she observed, "We followed all the laws that the white people themselves made, but we learned the hard way that even though we had all the laws and all the righteousness on our side, that white man is not going to give up his power to us. We have to take it for ourselves." Whether the final outcome of the challenge was seen as a loss or a victory, the MSDP stand in Atlantic City was undoubtedly historically significant. First, it sent a message to the white bastion of power in the South that black Mississippians would no longer collaborate in their own oppression through passive acceptance of human rights and civil rights violations, period. The MSDP stand notified Southern white supremacists and their sympathizers that they will be challenged by opponents using their own political institutions and legal system if necessary. The stand marked the beginning of the supremacist demise in the eyes of many. Second, the challenge was an important vehicle for exposing the virtual powerlessness of black Mississippians to the nation, thereby sustaining the attention of the federal government, first attracted by the 3 civil rights murders earlier that summer. This challenge had some influence on the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which provided for the presence of federal marshals in the South to oversee the registering of black voters. Traditional historical accounts attribute the creation and passage of the act to King and SCLC's Selma campaign. However, it is important not to underestimate the embarrassment faced by Lyndon Johnson when the official Mississippi delegation demanded that his party respond to the charges directed at the all-white delegation. The MSDP stand was certainly in the minds of Johnson and civil rights supporters in Congress when the Voting Rights Act was passed. Third, the MSDP challenge marked Hamer's emergence on the national scene. As a result of Hamer's appearance at the convention, she helped fuel a growing social movement by providing an example of courage and determination. Hamer was an inspirational leader of a movement constantly troubled by disappointment and uncertainty. Her personal tragedies and survival of them gave many black Mississippians hope. In August 1964, the entire nation experienced this sense of possibility. She was a symbol of what could be achieved if only endured the roughest of times. However, it would be inaccurate to attribute the growth of the movement only to her spiritual nourishment. She also influenced the movement in a very practical and fundamental way. As was evident in her individual contributions to the MSDP's growth, Hamer was an important institution builder. Last, the challenge was important for Hamer's evolution as a leader. From her defeat, Hamer learned in clear and definite terms that appealing to the federal government within the boundaries of law did not always bring the immediately desired remedy. In this lesson, Hamer got an all too difficult introduction to high-stakes interest group politics at the national level. Moreover, as she was introduced to the recalcitrance of the Lyndon Johnson administration, Hamer also encountered her first real debilitating conflict with national middle-class civil rights leaders, especially black clergymen and white liberals. In the long run, the challenge and its defeat marked a decline in relations between Hamer on the one hand and middle-class movement leaders and the slow-moving federal government on the other. As a result, she became increasingly interested in working to build strong local institutions for the problem that plagued her community. When the challenge was over, Hamer came away from it quite bitter and disillusioned, but ultimately even more resolved to press her point. The poor would and should have a voice in their own destiny through meaningful franchise. Ironically, she also came away from this defeat in a better position to assist the movement financially due to the broader audience she won with her dramatic testimony about the horrible Winona beating. Despite, or perhaps because of, the MSDP's defeat and her subsequent bitterness, Hamer continued her grassroots political work by recruiting prospective voters and preaching about the powers of the ballot and other crucial issues. In 1965, she made yet another challenge to take away the power of white Mississippi politicians. This time, the scene was the United States Congress. Fannie Lou was a bad mamma jamma. You hear me? Okay, so that's the end of chapter 5. We're going to pick up fresh in a new year, in a new chapter, chapter 6, on our next reading. Thank y'all for tuning in. Again, if you're not subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do yourself a favor and do so. It's my name, Morgan Myers, 1 E in my last name, M-Y-E-R-S. Or you can type in Storytime with Moremy, M-O-R-E-M-Y, and a playlist will pop up with about 200 and something videos in there. Go ahead and subscribe, and you'll see these readings, past readings, and future readings to come. I appreciate y'all for tuning in. I hope y'all have a great rest of y'all day. Love on yourself and someone else you care about.